Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this very ambitious and very timely event. It's called Responding to China's Influence in Southeastern, Central and Eastern Europe. It may be a bit of a mouthful, but by the time this hour is up, you will know, hopefully, everything about the region. This has been a very important project that was undertaken by a group of scholars spanning the great Carnegie family from Washington, Beijing, France, Brussels, all over. And it really is part of a kind of global Carnegie project, looking at strategic regions separately, and indeed looking at China's role in South Asia. Needless to say, and I'm not biased, we have a stellar cast. We have Tamás Matura from the Cornell University, and Tamás is a Hungarian specialist, and he works very closely on. Actually, in fact, he's the founder of the Central and East European Centre for Asian Studies, which is actually very timely given China's influence in Hungary. I think everybody knows Tom de Waal. I was going to say he's an old Caucasus hand. In fact, he's not old. He's quite young, but he looked at Caucasus, and Tom will be chipping in on Georgia and other areas. We have, and I'm sure everybody knows, Andreea Brînză from Bucharest, the Vice President of the Romanian Institute for the Study of the Asia-Pacific region, which is very, very important for Romania's situation, given China's influence in the Black Sea and further into the Western Balkans. And we have Philippe Le Corre. I don't know how to describe Philip, because he seems to know everything about the Indo-Pacific and Australia and French politics and transatlantic relations. But Philip has homed in on Greece. We have 1 hour, and please use the chat to send questions. Hopefully, we'll have some time to chip out to the audience as we move along. But don't be shy. Ask questions. Target them who you want to, and be as open as you like. Within the realms of intellectual propriety. So I think we should start there. Philip, I'm going to put you in the hot seat. You've done extensive research on Greece. You've just written another piece for your Active. You've written for us as well. I think I'd like to really ask you to briefly explain China's main foreign policy objectives in Europe. Why is it these countries in Southeastern Europe? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Judy. Very, very nice to be in such good company. Hello, everybody. Let me just first say that China's presence in Europe has been, a mix of opportunism and strategy. That's what I tend to say in all my lectures. So sorry for the repetition, but China's European presence is primarily an economic story, you could say. As China needed to expand, the natural resources, exports, acquire technologies from Europe, all these stories are fairly well known. And this has led to a massive campaign of investments, mainly in Western Europe, the UK, Germany, France, and Italy, between 2010 and 2017, mainly. Up to now, that's where Chinese FDI have developed, sometimes failed, sometimes succeeded. But there's another story, which is the one we're trying to tell in this report, which is Beijing interest in building a community of friends among smaller, more vulnerable states. And following the 2000 financial crisis that we all know, China became a player in some of the Southeastern, Eastern, and Central European countries, including those we are studying here. And it launched a 17+1 group of countries that Tamás knows so much about, or Andreea, and also the Belt and Road Initiative, which is somewhat quieter these days, especially in Europe, but it's still going on. So typically there are two sides of the coin, and what we're trying to do in this report is to look at the characteristic of these countries: weak state institutions, captured able states and systems, civil society with relatively few independent voices in the media, China experts, and so on. These are not big countries, but all of them have an interesting China story to tell. And they somewhat benefited from China's presence, although China also underlined through its presence the governance shortfalls and the vulnerabilities of these economies. So perhaps, at this point, I should let my colleagues speak, and I think each case study is interesting. We have really different countries here, and I'll be happy to talk about any country, especially Greece, later on.
Thanks, Phil. Before I turn to Tom de Waal, I want to ask if when a country or government invests, there's a reason for investment. Short-term, long-term, profit, influence. Can you link the investment to a foreign policy objective, Philip?
Well, that's why I started talking about opportunism, because the 2008 financial crisis, it wasn't written that China was going to step in, but there weren't enough people to step in. There weren't enough countries or institutions. And as you recall very well, Judy, from your time as a European correspondent, Portugal, Greece, many of these countries, and Eastern Europe, these countries were in need for a partner. And China was kind of ready. It was kind of the peak of foreign reserves of China, and also the start of an ambition that was materialized, so to speak, with the 17+1, with the Belt and Road Initiative, and certainly, the port of Piraeus, which I'll comment later on what is an important place because it's at the heart of the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean is part of the maritime Silk Road.
Okay, thank you, Philippe, for sort of setting the stage for this. Now, Tom, this is, I just want to remind those who are tuning in that this is a very special report because it doesn't jump all over the place. It has the same template for each country, fantastic graphics, and you can extrapolate all sorts of information that you can apply to the other countries as well. And that's the very unique aspect of this report. What happens in Hungary, the themes are pursued in other countries in the region. So I just want to alert you that this is it's a really good read and in some ways a must read. Tom, I want to get to you could you say something briefly maybe about the scope and the key findings of the report, please?
Sure. Thank you, Judy, and great to see you all. Yes, I think it's important to say that obviously we wanted to cover certain themes in the report, obviously Chinese economic investments and how that was a tool, the political relationships between China and the elites in these various countries, Chinese influence in things like academia and the media. And we held a series of seminars in which Tamás and Andreea were involved, looking at each country separately, but also looking at the cross-cutting themes. And I think it's fair to say that there are common themes, but also very, very important differences. I mean, we'll hear in a moment about the differences between Hungary and Romania, which are quite remarkable. And then Georgia, another post-socialist country with a very different trajectory. So I think it's fair to say that maybe the Chinese strategy was and is the same in all of these countries, but the local realities and the local responses, which is also what we're writing about, of course, are incredibly different.
That's a really interesting point, Tom. Andreea, could I ask you to come in on this, because Romania is a neighbour of Hungary, and yet the differences are quite different in your relationship with the EU, your relationship with NATO, your perception of the Black Sea. How do you see China fitting into this kind of model or influence in this part of Europe?
Thank you, Judy. I like to think that Romania exemplifies very well China's Central and Eastern European relations, because we, at the beginning, back in 2012, 2030, we have a Romania that was developed very close relations to China. And then lately, we have a Romania that pivoted away from China because many things, including the disillusionment with all the Chinese investments that were only promises and they didn't materialize. On the contrary, they were abandoned or canceled. Or we have also the influence of the United States and the European Union, because we have this the competition between China and the United States amplified, and Romania chose to take the United States side. And in order to prove that it's a staunch ally of the United States and the European Union, it undertook a series of measures, like it was the first country that banned the
5G.
Signed an MOU that was targeting Huawei on 5G, although without mentioning it. Also, it was a country that banned the Chinese company in taking part in public infrastructure project tenders. Also, it downgraded its participation to the latest 17+1 summit. This one that was hosted by Xi Jinping, and also it canceled a very important nuclear power plant, Chernobyl. So I think it's important to see these all aspects because we can see here that Romania succeeded this type of resilience, because I know that the report approached these topics mainly because the elites were pro-West and not so much interested in China from a political or strategic perspective. And I want to end by saying that this happened to all the region, although the region tends to be looked to as China was looked at China backyard. In reality, we were the region, the Central and Eastern European region, was very determined to follow the Western values while taking advantage of possible Chinese investments in the region.
Mm-hmm. It's very interesting you say this, Andreea. I mean, given that Romania broke with Comecon, and I was wondering, China tried to exploit these divisions in some ways, but surely China must have made a much more aggressive attempt to cultivate the elites in Romania, given the geostrategic importance of Romania, the Black Sea, its relationship to the Western Balkans, its close ties with NATO. And yet you're saying somehow the pro-Western elites, despite all the problems in Romania with the political situation, they managed to unite in terms of keeping a kind of quiet distance with China, which is interesting.
Yes, it is. But I also want to say that China, I don't want to call it strategy, but I don't have anything in my mind, has this, let's say, strategy to invest a lot of effort in dealing with one or two party or leader that is in power. That happened with Victor Ponta back in 2013. They developed very good relations. They also have very good relations with the Social Democratic Party. But in Romania, both Victor Ponta and its government, and also the government that was leading by Social Democratic Party, was replaced by a right-wing party. And
Yes.
the leaders from the right-wing party or the coalition, right-wing coalition, weren't so interested in develop relations with China. On the contrary, they will sometimes tend to use their relations, the Social Democratic Party relations with China, to criticize the party. So they were taking a step back.
Indeed. Thank you for this, Andreea. Now, Tamás, Hungary. Now, this is a very interesting story, because I remember doing a huge piece on Hungary and China back in about 2011, 2012, and I visited the chemical companies, I visited the schools, I visited kindergartens, I visited the Chinese Department of University. I've visited the huge Chinese bazaar between the airport and the center of town, and China was already really on the ground there. What is it? What is it about Hungary and China that we don't know about, or we should know about, or what's the agenda?
Well, thank you, Judy, and thanks for having me today at this excellent panel. And I would start with pointing at the extraordinary strengths of the report. I believe that for a long time, this report is the very first one that tries to analyze the situation in a very objective and in a very sober way. So when we look at, for example, the recommendations of the report, let me point out three of those recommendations. So first of all, the report starts with suggesting that it's a mistake to portray Central European countries as a Trojan horse of China in Central Europe. A second important thing, that it's also a mistake to portray China's economic influence in Central Europe as something overwhelming or something very, very strong. And the third of the many, many excellent suggestions I would like to point at is that individual leaders like Viktor Orban, Prime Minister of Hungary, they play a pivotal role in forging closer relations between countries of Central Europe and China. So when it comes to Hungary, I think all three of these recommendations are super important. First of all, the Chinese economic presence in the country is not that strong at all. Of course, we could argue whether, it's a glass full or half of water, or half full or half empty. But I believe that if we look at the data, it's not really convincing. So the level of Chinese FDI in the country is still marginal, 3 to 4% of the total stock of foreign direct investment in the country. When it comes to Hungarian exports to China, it's something like less than 2% of our total exports. And I could go on, about these economic data. And when we look at, whether there is a social support behind the pro-China policies of the government, there isn't. The Hungarians, like 50% of the population, has a negative view of China, and only 25% supports closer relations to the People's Republic of China. And we can go on with all of these arguments, but it all boils down to one single issue, and that is the Prime Minister and the governing party. That it is seemingly Viktor Orban and some members of the elite of the governing party who genuinely believe that the future belongs to the East. They genuinely believe that the West is on the brinks of collapse, and migration will overflow Western countries, and the European Union is about to go down in history as a disaster. I also think that they really believe that this new age of Eurasia is the future of Hungary. And there are, of course, some private business interests that also kind of push the Hungarian government towards forging better relations to China. And another thing that should be taken into consideration, that this very fact that individual leaders like Viktor Ponta of Romania a few years ago, or like Miloš Zeman of the Czech Republic as of today, and like Viktor Orban, they seem to be, in the focal point of Chinese influence in the region. But I also tend to argue that Chinese influence, even in Hungary, it's kind of a mirage, because should Viktor Orban lose elections next year, Chinese influence would evaporate like overnight. So there is no structural Chinese influence in the country. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be concerned. I'm not saying that we shouldn't, keep an eye and monitor on the development of China's presence in Hungary and in other countries. But it's not that structural as many would believe.
I mean, it's interesting you bring up the statistics, the 3 or 4% of foreign investment China in the region. Actually, it's more or less the same for every country in the region, which is very interesting. Before we get into the bigger picture, we have to look at Greece. I mean, since the global financial crisis, and Philippe, you're well placed there, the Chinese have been looking at places up for sale, privatization, and there seems to be now a pushback. Could you give us a brief picture of this? I always understood it to be quite deep, this Chinese investment influence in Greece, but I wasn't quite sure what they wanted to do with it besides a big EU, an important EU country and a market.
So again, Judy, it's a mixed picture here. On one hand, you had, in the middle of the summer, the Greek government, the conservative government, granting the additional 16% of the Piraeus Port Authority capital to COSCO, China Shipping Company, the largest Chinese shipping company, a state-owned company, of course, which in a way completes the deal. They now run the show, run the harbor, 67% of the whole thing. But at the same time, a lot of disgruntled people, due to the fact that they did not deliver. And they did not deliver on an additional pier, on hotels, on a shipbuilding facility, and they did not deliver also because people did not want those to happen, because there have been opponents, and among those unions, of course, shipbuilders, ship owners sometimes, environmental associations, and citizens and local politicians. So that's quite a lot of people to oppose the largest investment, foreign investment, which was supposed to be the savior of the Piraeus harbor. And indeed, COSCO helped the harbor to position itself better in the Mediterranean. But what the Chinese did really was to divert traffic, container traffic from other ports to Piraeus, which ended up quite well. So it did bring a lot of business, but they did not win other major investments, other contracts, in Greece, particularly not the train line, they were hoping to connect Eastern Europe with Southern Europe. So and of course 2 years of COVID-19. Public opinion has very mixed views about China. 44% of the Greeks surveyed, in April, think the COVID originated in China, and the propaganda didn't really work. Wasn't really a success in terms of convincing the Greek population.
Indeed. Thank you, Philippe, for this. I think this was going to dovetail very nicely with my general question. I was going to ask, why on earth are we discussing China in Eastern Europe and the Western Balkans? And this very question comes in here. It's from Plamen Tonchev, head of Asia unit at the Athens-based Institute of International Economic Relations, IIER. Mr. Tonchev, if I may, I will just use one of your questions. To what degree is China's strategy in the 4 countries in question customized, that is, country-specific? Tom, could you give us the overview on that, please?
Well, let me just say a few words about Georgia, if you don't mind, Judy, because
sure. Okay. Oh, yes. Okay.
Interesting that we.
I wasn't going to forget about it.
No, I'm sure you weren't. But it's interesting that we chose one non-EU country as a kind of as a different case, and I think it was quite illuminating. I was the person who, because of my Caucasus expertise, who wrote the Georgia chapter here. And I think it was interesting that in this case, this was about 5 or 6 years ago. There were a lot of Georgians getting quite excited about China, Georgia. There was big Georgian delegations going to China. That Georgia hosted the Silk Road Forum, so-called, in Tbilisi. There was one of the inaugural meetings of the AIIB, the Chinese Investment Bank. Then in 2017, China signed its first FTA, free trade agreement, with a post-socialist country, and that was Georgia. And I think there was a kind of misconception on both sides, which I think is possibly every country has its specifics. But here, the Georgians, seeing this as a geopolitical game, their main issue geopolitically is always internationally is to find partners as a counterweight against Russia. They saw China, a developing relationship with China, as important there, and the Chinese looking for markets, basically. There was, I think, a lot too much emphasis put on the idea of this lovely idea of the Silk Road going through the Caucasus. But when you actually start to look at the statistics of the East-West trade, only about 1% of Chinese trade to Europe and Turkey goes through the Caucasus. And when you start to look at the map, you look at the crossing the Caspian Sea, different countries, then crossing the Black Sea, the Bosphorus, a rather aged infrastructure, different customs regimes, and so on. You suddenly realize that, yes, this is actually rather an expensive niche route. And no wonder that most Chinese East-West trade goes either north via Russia, the Russian landmass, or the cheapest route, of course, is if a bit longer, is by sea via the Suez Canal. So again, a kind of
missed
an
opportunity.
over-exaggeration. Well, an
Yes.
over-exaggeration also of the strategic importance on both sides.
Well, exactly, and especially on the Georgian side, you mentioned you bring this word counterweight, but was it ever spelt out, a counterweight to Russia? In what way? Was it investment? Was it geostrategic? Was it? Could you be a bit more specific on that?
Yeah, I think what the Georgians are always hoping for is kind of political support in international fora against Russia, increased international presence of various countries, whether it be economic and political, always trying to kind of have multiple bets to dilute Russian influence, and they thought China would do that. But of course, as we know, for China, Russia is the far more important relationship, and we saw that during the pandemic when suddenly China and Russia got much closer, and indeed the Chinese media there was a scare story about this biological laboratory in Tbilisi, the Luga laboratory, and the Chinese media repeating the same scare stories as the Russians about that lab.
In some ways, what the four of you are describing is that there is, in fact, a kind of customized approach by China to the region, which perhaps is quite short-sighted, given how the region is not monolithic. It's not homogeneous. It's quite diverse in many ways, from the elite level, from the societal level, from the cultural level. I was wondering, has China made a mistake in its approach to the region?
Yes.
Andreea.
Yes, actually, that's what I wanted to say, because with the 17+1 initiative, China tends to treat all the whole region as a monolith, as you said, and it didn't take into account the differences between the countries, because we have in the north, for example, countries that are more interested in human rights. And also on the eastern flank, we have countries that are very aware of Russia and what a possible Russian invasion could mean for them. Also, we have countries that are more open to China because they are more neutral, like Croatia, for example. So China didn't treat these countries as individually. On the contrary, it put it on the same basket, and I think it's a big mistake. And also, because of this, it didn't have the opportunity to see each peculiarities of the region in order to obtain more influence, for example, to develop its power in the region, if that was its intent. Yeah.
Well, that's a very interesting answer, Andreea, given the size of the foreign ministry in Beijing and the number of experts it has on Europe. We have a really relevant, interesting question from Ronald Linden, Professor Emeritus at Political Science, University of Pittsburgh. This is a great question. You all have to now, you really have to pay attention to this. How did Carnegie decide on these four countries? Two large and geopolitically significant targets of Chinese interest, Turkey and Hungary are not included. Are they next for Carnegie's attention, especially their significance to the Black Sea? I would also ask, what about Germany? Anyway, I shall leave this with you. How did you choose them and why? Tamás, could you briefly answer why you chose those particular countries?
Well, maybe I should come in first. Let Tamás. I don't want Tamás to be embarrassed since he's not really but he's helped us a lot, no doubt about this, and I want to hear more from him. But I think this is an unusual group of countries. Admittedly, I think Ron Linden is right. The fact one country is not an EU member, the fact Hungary is a bit of an outlier. But at the same time, you could get it closer to Greece in the sense that both of them blocked EU resolutions on human rights or on the Uyghur situation at the United Nations Human Rights Commission back in June or at the European level. So they are both opportunistic in their ways of pleasing the Chinese government as part of the partnership, I would say. Even though the current Mitsotakis government is, of course, much more cautious, much closer to the West, to NATO. I mean, obviously Turkey, which Professor Linden mentioned, is obviously a big concern to the Greek government, and it's not the Chinese who are going to come and help if the security situation deteriorates. And as far as Romania is concerned, I think I did with Andreea, in fact, a lot of the Romania research, and I was quite surprised to see that this old friend, 老朋友, as we say in Chinese, this old friend of China would be so skeptical, really, and the young people of Romania being so skeptical of the Chinese model as an alternative. I think Romania is very much part of the West, and in fact, the current government, the current president particularly, was extremely close to Donald Trump. So, obviously the connections are not obvious. I mean, there are some former, members of the socialist bloc, and there's Greece, which is, an ancient civilization, as China likes to repeat ever again. But they have common ground in the sense that, they have weaknesses. Their institutions were weak at some stage, and the response was somewhat weak, and there's a lack of expertise, perhaps, but it's changing, as we can see from our panel, of which we have two prominent members.
But whether or not we're going to Carnegie will do another report widening the taking in other countries, the decisions and the votes that, for instance, Romania and Greece and Hungary, how they voted and actually opposed an EU resolution on Chinese human rights situation, it actually weakens a common European foreign policy. And secondly, we've seen the complete lack of solidarity with some of the Baltic states actually opening up a Taiwan office. So we say that, China they haven't quite got their strategy right, but when it comes to pressure on individual countries, they certainly can exert it. Otherwise, we wouldn't have Hungary opposing an EU position, nor Greece, nor Romania, the three very countries that are under this discussion. And I'm sure if Georgia was in the EU, it would have voted along with the EU, actually. So essentially, we can say on the one hand, investment is very low, but actually political influence or pressure does seem to be quite high on certain voting patterns. Is this a correct statement to make? Tamás?
Yeah, thank you. So I think one of the recommendations, what I mentioned before, was that it's a mistake to describe Central European countries, even Hungary, as a Trojan horse of China. And the reason for that recommendation is very simple. You just mentioned that Hungary might have been under pressure from China to block this and that statement of the EU. Probably it's on the contrary, that Hungary was kind of volunteering without any Chinese pressure. It was kind of a volunteering country what tried, Viktor Orban, the prime minister, tried to send, positive message, like a political gift or present to China. And it's not like the Chinese exerting pressure over Hungary. I haven't had the chance to visit China for the last 2 years for obvious reasons, but before that, I have had many consultations with Chinese colleagues. And it wasn't once or twice when they kind of subtly, complained about Hungarian actions. And I was told that, hey, Tamás, we do understand that the Hungarian government wants to send this positive message to China by blocking this and that in the EU. But actually, sometimes it's a little bit embarrassing to Beijing because, it kind of spills mud on EU-China relations and 17+1 relations. So Hungary is sometimes an eager beaver and not kind of a Trojan horse of the Chinese.
Mm-hmm. You may all see on your chat, let's take the second question first. Few in the Balkans, I don't know who this question is from, few in the Balkans or Eastern Europe wish to emulate Chinese society. Touched on this. Maybe the food, actually. The essence of soft power. This is important. Cultural diplomacy, Confucius census, etc., does not itself amount to soft power. So, how does the panel evaluate the overall impact of Chinese pressure? Great question, because soft power does come into this. Tom, would you like to take up the soft power issue, please?
Sure. Well, I can say a few words about Georgia, but obviously,
and the others can chip in.
the Confucius centers is obviously a way that China exerts soft power, across Europe. But a few things to be said. Tamás can talk about the university in Budapest, which I think is probably the most. I think that's worth stopping on particularly. But a few things to be said. First is that learning Chinese is not necessarily a sign of that you're submitting to a Chinese political agenda. There are lots of people learning Chinese all over the world. I think Philippe has pretty good Chinese, but is certainly not an agent of Chinese influence, as do some of our other colleagues. Secondly, when it comes to and Georgia is a good example here. When it comes to some of the other countries, the soft power of the United States, for example, is far greater, despite all the money China has been putting in. So, for example, one of the biggest department in Georgia where people are learning Chinese has 150 students, but in the United States has a number of scholarship programs where several hundred Georgians a year go from high school students to postgraduates. They go on US government exchanges, plus several hundred more privately funded exchanges, and then all the other tools of US soft power are far greater. So I think it's only where the Chinese have put in really significant resources, and maybe we should turn to Tamás to talk about that university in Budapest, that it seems to be having more of an impact.
Yeah, thank you. So let me get back for a moment to the question of Blum and Tonchev, what Andreea already answered in part. So whether China tried to implement a general approach to Central European countries, or whether that it was a little bit custom made. And my argument is that China is running on a study curve or a learning curve. At the very beginning, of course, it was a very general approach. As Andreea perfectly pointed it out, the Chinese really believed that the Central European region was and is homogeneous, and we are all like the same, old commies and friends of the People's Republic of China. Meanwhile, in the past few years, I think the Chinese had to understand that there are these differences, that Estonia is very different from Serbian approach towards China. And the biggest mistake I think they did, or they made, was that they followed the Chinese tradition of the top-down approach. That, as far as I understand, in most of the countries, they approach the elite, the political and the economic elite, and not, the wider public. So, and here through this, I can transfer to the next question about Chinese soft power. Yeah. There is no Chinese soft power in Central Europe, or it's very rudimentary. Let me talk a moment about the five.
Excuse me, Tamás. Just for our outsiders, we should read that question. It's from David Frederick Chambon, research fellow at the Asian Studies Sciences Po. Why has Chinese soft power seemed to have failed in winning public approval, which you were going to touch on. I think this is a really important question, and I'd like you all to chip in. Please, Tamás, sorry to interrupt you.
Sure. So I think Chinese soft power has been failing globally, not only in Central and Eastern Europe. So the report perfectly touches upon the question of the 5 Confucius Institutes in Hungary. What is a lot, for a country of 10 million people, that we have 5 around the country. But when you really talk to people at Confucius Institutes privately, they always admit that there are 500 people in a country or in a city of 200,000, for example, in the countryside, And the very same 500 people visit their programs every single year. So most of these Confucius Institutes can reach out to those who are inherently interested in Chinese culture, but they have no capacity to convince the rest of the society that China is a role model, or could be a role model to Central European countries. So generally speaking, I think Chinese soft power in Central Europe is extremely limited, and no surprise, most of the Hungarians who emigrate, they go to the West and not to China.
Andreea, I think you touched on this before, on the 16/17+1. Do you think this will fade in influence given COVID, given the pandemic, given the EU, given this tussle between America and the EU over China? Will it weaken because China isn't delivering on the soft power even? Andreea,
if I may.
Andreea, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm looking at this. I mean, a question from Michael Lee, Senior Fellow at Royal, about the 17+1. Will it disintegrate? Will it be a talk shop? Will it weaken? Will it get stronger? Or is it already not much of a substantial forum?
I can take this question if you'll allow me. I used to call the 17+1 mechanism a zombie mechanism, because actually it doesn't do too much. It doesn't do much, and it's just a bunch of summits, yearly summits, where people are gathering in order to discuss nothing, basically, because we don't have follow-up of those promises. We have only promises. We don't have a project that was implemented and was discussed at the 17+1. For example, and Tamás could say more about the Budapest-Belgrade railway, which, from my point of view, is in a standstill. Although that Serbia built a part of the section, it's very difficult to see it going to an end. And also, yes,
Philip,
if I can just add a few comments on the Chinese soft power. I think it has. I agree with Tamás. It hasn't worked globally. Perhaps more in Asia or in Africa, but certainly not in Europe. And it's a combination of reasons. One reason is the so-called wolf warrior diplomats, who haven't helped really by attacking the countries where they're based. I've never heard of anything like that. And secondly, of course, COVID-19 has not helped. There's still so many doubts about the origins of this pandemic and the lack of transparency in China and access to experts, to international experts of the WHO. And then finally, of course, the West has sort of fought back. Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, the previous Secretary of State, went to Greece twice. He traveled all over Europe for 3 years. It seems, he seemed to enjoy his travels. But he was there, sort of half, helping, half threatening, and threatening these countries that were going to go for the Chinese 5G suppliers and you name it. But generally, I would say the real problem with Chinese soft power is that on one hand you have the Chinese narrative, which is everything is beautiful, everything is happy. China is a benign power that is not going to harm anybody, and we're going to help. The Greece is going to be this ancient civilization, and Romania is an old friend, and Hungary is also an old friend, but also a new friend. But the perception locally is completely different. And that's the problem that this Chinese regime has globally, to look at other countries, other cultures, in a very sort of objective way. It does look at things through its own eyes, only, exclusively. And it seems that one of the reasons might be the diplomats that I was referring to earlier.
But also one of the reasons may be the virtue of the system itself and the training on how you view the world through this very narrow prism in some ways. We've got a question from Ron Linden again, and from Tonch Plamet. I'll take up Ron Linden's question because it's the backlash. he mentioned the question of domestic backlash, anti-Chinese sentiment. Philip, you touched in Greece over Piraeus, or Hungary because of the huge money problem, or the Belgrade Budapest highway. Does this limit Chinese influence? I would follow this on with another question. Has the Chinese done their homework?
Well, you know, in the case of the train line, you know, even in Serbia, it didn't take off for many years.
Exactly.
And on the Hungarian side, I'll let Tamás comment on this. But you know, the EU obviously stepped in and said, well, the process wasn't right, and so the prime minister had to go under the table and to find another way. But even that is not seem to work.
Okay.
Tamás, you want to add on this?
Yeah, sure. So when it comes to the Budapest-Belgrade railway line, it's indeed, it has been a very long story. So if I'm not mistaken, it was mentioned first somewhere in 2013. But actually, a few weeks ago, Hungarian and Chinese and Serbian ministers laid the cornerstone or the corner track section of the railway line in the Hungarian part. So something is going on, very slowly, but something is going on. But actually, it offers me a great opportunity to talk a few sentences about the Fudan University campus, because quite surprisingly, even though the railway project is much bigger when it comes to its financial budget, the railway has never really caught the attention of the Hungarian wider public. The Fudan University campus has. So earlier this year, I was really surprised to see, and I think the Hungarian and the Chinese government was equally surprised to see that the Fudan University scandal was, for many, many years, the very first China-related scandal what finally enabled opposition parties to realize that there was and there is political ammunition in, you know, a fair amount of China bashing in the country. And no other issues, no other China-related projects have ever triggered such a widespread political and public backlash against the Chinese. And now the Hungarian opposition tries its best to, you know, keep the whole story afloat, while the Hungarian government tries to postpone the project and make it, you know, disappear because elections are coming next May.
Indeed, and I think they have special streets now named after Hong Kong and human rights activists in
Indeed,
Budapest.
indeed.
Tom, can you take up Andreea Brînză? He's been patient about the Andreea port in the project in Georgia. It was promoted by China. Was this an upset for, that is gone now, was this an upset for Georgia's BRI plans in the Black Sea?
Not really. I do. There's a lot about the Andreea project in the chapter, but we really have to go down in some weeds and I'll try and be very brief. But it was actually a project more supported by the United States than by China, and by a certain section of the Georgian elite who wanted to see a deep water port in Georgia. There was a consortium formed in 2016. There was a tender. The Chinese were initially interested in that tender, but didn't get it. It was actually mainly American. Seattle port actually won that tender. Then 2020 it was suspended, but mainly because of Georgian domestic politics. Where the Chinese come in was actually in Georgia's other port, the rival port of Poti, the older port, where the Chinese tried to invest in the free industrial zone in Poti. But that was the rather notorious Chinese company called CEFC, who rather spectacularly went bankrupt. Various of their leading officials were arrested. And so the Chinese ended up getting rather burned in that project, and rather powerful members of the Georgian business elite have basically taken over that free industrial zone and are promoting that as the project that they want to see go forward. Which is, I think, it's all of an object lesson that in a country like Georgia, where there's some very powerful political business vested interests, even a powerful country like China can come unstuck if you don't do your homework, and that's what's happened to the Chinese there. It's not actually a very good outcome for Georgia, because Georgia does need a modernized port, and there's this now rivalry between two projects, various people backing one project or another. Neither of them seems to be getting, you know, the sufficient capital or political support that it needs. But that's a rather separate story, which doesn't have so much to do with China.
We have,
if I may add,
yeah,
Judy,
please,
I
Philippe.
think
Yeah.
Tom's example is excellent because across the board, you look at countries where cases of failed investment projects have taken place, and in fact, much beyond that. You look at Poland, you could look at France, you look at Italy. Many cases where the Chinese did not deliver. That's what I said at the beginning. They were successful stories, but there are also very, very many failed stories, and that's due to this sort of misunderstandings, really cultural misunderstandings, political misunderstandings, and sometimes the fact that we're dealing with state-owned enterprises that are entities of the Chinese Communist Party as opposed to private companies, and of course the misunderstanding with a directly elected government is complete, and especially these governments come and go, especially in Romania, Andreea.
Yeah, in some ways, you do ask that you do deal with that question about Europe's strong economies. Is it pushing the weaker ones to work with China? Well, more or less, all of you said actually it doesn't generate this kind of political identity. We've only got 9 minutes left. 2 brief questions. When I was in Poland doing a Chinese story, the Chinese were building the Łódź highway from Łódź, I think, to Warsaw. First of all, it overran costs. Secondly, it was shoddy work. Thirdly, it wasn't completed on time. And fourthly, guess what? It was EU structural funds. Now, my question is this: has the EU finally cottoned on to the fact that some of these Chinese investments are on the back of EU taxpayers' money? And do any of the panelists, are they aware now that the EU is suddenly realizing they have to make much more of an effort to actually control how this structural and development funds are used? A very important question for our listeners out there: are these studies going to continue? So if we could deal with the structural funds first, how to counteract this Chinese investment influence, and the other question to wrap up.
Well, I would say, Judy, that if you look at the EU's China policy over the past 2 years, you see massive changes. You see massive tools, whether it's investment screening mechanisms, whether it's level playing field, market access, state aid. All these issues are being dealt with. 5G toolbox, and especially dealing with state entities receiving EU funds, as you pointed out. And I think there's the example of this bridge in Croatia, obviously, which was funded with Chinese money, with European money, and that's been built by a Chinese state-owned company, has been written about a lot, because it's kind of a counter example of what should be done, really. And I think for a country, for an EU country to use European funding for to help a non-European entity, I think it's not a good idea. But I think Brussels has completely changed. The attitude has changed, and as one European official told me a few weeks ago, Europe may not be very good at engaging with China, but it's very good at defending itself now.
Well, I hope that applies to the Western Balkan countries, actually, where China is very much involved in Serbia and in some other countries in the region. What else do we have on the agenda? Since this is such a far-reaching report and it covers so much ground, there seems to be a huge appetite from our listeners to want to know more. Any other countries on the agenda? Since this is part of the Global Carnegie project, I mean, it would be very interesting to see a comparison of Germany, for instance, and Britain, and as one of our audience pointed out, Turkey and Ukraine. Philippe, since it seems to be in one of the driving seats, are there more projects in hand looking at this very important area?
So, of course, we should underline that our sister report is China's influence in South Asia, which covers also 4 countries: Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and the Maldives. And that's been run by our colleague Deep Pal, who has used a lot of local experts to to feed him. And it's an excellent report. And in 2 days, as our Carnegie colleagues will probably tell us in the chat, there will be another event online staged by Carnegie, which will look through these 4 countries, these 4 case studies. There are some similarities between these European countries and these Asian and these South Asian countries, in the sense that it's not one-sided. It's a mixed picture. It's not like China runs everything. And they're good and bad, and it's not like China is buying over these countries or these sub-regions. Meanwhile, the Carnegie Endowment's Asia program, which is led by Evan Feigenbaum, is running all kinds of interesting projects which have to do with Chinese influence in other parts of the world, including in Latin America and in Central Asia, which I would point out as well. So Carnegie is involved on a long-term China abroad strategy, if you want, and it is all part of it.
Yeah, you've been unbelievably disciplined in your answers, which means that we have a minute each per respondent. And here's the question: has the EU learned from China's involvement in Central Europe, and has the Chinese learned from its mistakes, or at all from its involvement in the 4 countries you've looked at? Andreea, briefly, you've got 1 minute. Sorry.
It is hard to say, but hopefully yes, because China has done a lot of mistakes in the region, and as Tamás pointed out, the trend seems to change. And also, I've read Chinese expertise that are saying that yes, the region is disillusioned with our action, but hopefully in the future we can change it. And in regards to European Union, yes, I think it also learned. And I'll use Romania as an example because the ban on the Chinese companies taking part in the public infrastructure tenders was at the recommendation of the European Union. So the European Union started to request.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. Next door in Hungary, Tamás.
Yeah, I believe that the EU has learned a lot, as Philip mentioned, that in the past 3-4 years, the EU has really beefed up its toolbox vis-a-vis China. And I know that a lot of other issues, a lot of other tools are being developed or under development in Brussels. Whether the Chinese learned from it or not, well, it's a little bit hard to tell, because I think, generally speaking, on a global scale, Chinese foreign policy is at crossroads. As we mentioned, wolf warrior diplomacy, the power transition or the lack of power transition coming up in China. I think all of these things are under consideration in China. But I'm definitely sure that they learned that extensive promises that never materialize, that's a big mistake. So you have to walk the talk. But my last sentence says that we still should not write off the Chinese and their presence in Central Europe. They can learn, they adopt, and definitely they are waiting for the results of the German governmental coalition agreement, because that's one of the major issues that may have an impact on the Central European countries' China policy.
Indeed, that's another story. Thank you, Tamás. Tom, well, the EU promises a lot too. What's your take on these? The double-edged questions?
The same story, Judy. I mean, the China's made a lot of mistakes, but no room for complacency. And one thing we haven't mentioned, I'll just mention very briefly, is vaccine diplomacy. Whereas actually the Chinese delivered, more than 1 million Chinese vaccines to Georgia. Georgians authorized the Chinese vaccines before WHO approval. That was because the EU had failed in its vaccine diplomacy to Georgia. At that point, there were tens of thousands of European vaccines to Georgia. The only reason that the Chinese did not make a bigger success of that was a even worse reason, which was the general skepticism overall of the Georgian public towards vaccines altogether. But that's really a sign that not to be complacent about this.
Last word to Philip. So the EU better increase and intensify its soft power.
Yes, well, two points really. I think first of all, none of these countries actually oppose the EU strategy on China. I mean, among the three among the four, even Hungary, even Greece, they did oppose some resolutions, some non-binding resolutions, as a symbolic gesture towards China, because China cares a lot about faith. But they did not oppose the global strategy, calling China a partner, an economic competitor, and a systemic rival, for example. And secondly, I think the EU has is sort of starting to think about a third way vis-a-vis the Indo-Pacific or Asia, and that includes China, of course. And it should promote good governance and its values and all of this. And this will continue. And this is probably one of our best selling points towards these countries that may be on the margins of the EU, including the Balkans, which you mentioned rightfully, Judy.
Great. Well, we all stuck to the time. We could just talk for another hour or two. Thank you very, very much, Andreea Brînză, Tom de Waal, Tamás Matura, and Philippe Le Corre. I learned a huge amount. I hope our listeners enjoyed it. Thank you for being super audience, super panelists, and a great show. Thank you, Carnegie, Global Policy Carnegie. And we hope we'll all meet again soon. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.